Hello everybody, and welcome to what is inevitably going to be quite a long video, though I also believe it is going to be quite an important one. Let's talk about No Man's Sky. This is a game that just recently got an update, patch 1.3, and if you follow any kind of gaming news, you've probably heard about the hullabaloo around this, all of the talk and the chatter of how this update has drastically changed the game, and how the game is now in a place that is much like the trailers we saw before the game released, and not like the launch of the game. So essentially, it has turned this game into what we thought this game was going to be, and not the game that we got 1 year ago when the game launched. And that's a big deal, because this game, when we saw the trailers, we saw all of the pre-release content, everything that they showed before the game actually launched looked really good, and there was a reason there was a lot of hype there. It's because it looked awesome. It looked like a game that we really wanted. And then the game launched, and it wasn't that game at all. In fact, it was nowhere close to that game. And there were even people who were trying to take No Man's Sky, or rather Hello Games, to court over false advertising and stuff like that. And they were rightful in doing so, even though that's kind of a jerk thing to do. But at the same time, we didn't get remotely that game that was shown in trailers or press release footage or any kind of pre-release stuff that, that we ended up getting at launch that was drastically different. And I think that with this new update, it changes that game that we saw at launch into the game that we always had wanted from this. And that's a big deal. But it wasn't just this 1.3 update that did it. It was also 1.1 and 1.2 that set the foundation for 1.3 to be as successful as it is. In fact, if you go, and this is the interesting thing, if you go to Steam, most of the reviews, or rather the overwhelming amount of reviews before 1.3 were all negative. And if you looked at all of the reviews on there, it would say like mostly negative, and that's never a good thing to see on a game. And like the recent ones were overwhelmingly negative, and then 1.3 came out, and all of the reviews changed from mostly negative to mostly positive for all of the recent reviews. And even the fact that those are changing to mostly positive, it's changing the overall score of the game to start becoming positive as well. And it should be, because, again, the game launched in a bad state, but it is now in a good state. And there's something to be said about giving a game another chance. We'll talk about that later in this video. But at the end of the day, something interesting has happened in the gaming industry in the fact that a game launched, was awful, everybody hated it. Most people hated it, I should say, not everybody. Most people hated it. And then 1 year later, pretty much on its anniversary, essentially, we get a 1.3 update, and it completely drastically changes the game in a way that it goes from mostly negative to mostly positive with reviews, and it jumps right back up to the top of the sale list on Steam. So it was the most purchased game this week on Steam, and there were a ton of people playing it. And that's pretty unheard of, especially a year after launch, and with just essentially a patch coming to a game. You might see that with expansions and stuff, but you never really just see that with a normal patch. And I think that's a really big deal. And this is why we need to take notice of what the heck is happening in No Man's Sky. And I want to dive deep into the history here over the last year, what happened, and why this game is good. In fact, I've put in 30 hours of the game this week since 1.3. I've delayed this video over and over because I wanted to get a really solid grasp on what this game is now in order to convey it to you guys and tell you whether or not it is worth purchasing. But before we jump into any of that, I've avoided all of the new story stuff in the background. So all of the footage you're seeing in the background is me just kind of doing base building and getting resources and just general gameplay stuff. I've tried to avoid all of the story stuff, but there is a lot in the game now, so just know that I'm purposely avoiding it so you don't get spoiled. So let's back this up to the launch of the game. I did a impressions video at the launch. I had only really played a little bit of the game, a couple days worth, before I put out my impressions of like, what is this game? What do I think of it and everything? My conclusion was that it is a kind of cool space exploration game, but it is nothing like we saw in the trailers or any of the press release stuff from like E3 and all that in previous years on No Man's Sky. And if they had just marketed it as this kind of cool space exploration game that you know what? Let's be honest. It's kind of an early access game, though we're not going to call it that. I believe they should have, and I think it probably would have been a little bit more successful review-wise if it was just an early access game, especially because I consider 1.3 the actual launch of the real game that we got. But, you know, if they had gone back and just called it an early access game, I would have been happy with that. A lot of people would have been happy with that, and I think expectations would have been limited down to, okay, we see what this is. But my conclusion, again, was that it's okay, it's cool, it's not for everybody, and I'm kind of having a little bit of fun with it, but it's not necessarily for me either because I didn't stick around with it. And a lot of other people really slammed this game. And of course, massive negative reviews came out. And again, we've already talked about the fact that it was Hello Games was taken to court on several occasions for false advertising, and that's not a good position to be in with that studio. And what we see shortly after launch is Hello Games going completely radio silent, as they should have. I think maybe doing a little bit more discussion and talking about what was going on maybe would have been a bit better. But at the same time, I completely understand them going radio silent, because if I was in their situation and I released this subpar game, which they knew was going to be subpar because all the stuff that we saw in the press release stuff or pre-release trailers or whatever, that was their vision for the game. That's what they wanted the game to be, and they knew that that's not what they were shipping. And they were pressured by Sony, because Sony was helping fund the game, to get the game out, because it had already been quite a few years of hype and nothing really coming of it. So, you know, Sony pushed the game out, and I think they were right to do so. But Hello Games knew that they were not launching with the game they wanted to. So for them to go radio silent, completely understandable. A little bit of shame in there. I get that. In fact, that's probably a really hard time for the studio. And for me, I'm really interested in seeing what that story was and hearing about that story over the last year. And it's one of those things that, like, I really hope Danny O'Dwyer with No Clip does a documentary of this story of this game, because I think it's going to be fascinating to hear all the behind the scenes stuff. But the developers went completely radio silent. We didn't hear much, and then we got a 1.1 update called the Foundation update, and in it added some really cool stuff, and it did give people hope to the game that, like, okay, maybe there's some really cool stuff coming down the line. But it wasn't enough to bring a lot of people back. It certainly wasn't enough to bring me back, but I was interested in this stuff. So first and foremost, they added new game modes, like normal. So they separated it into normal, creative, and survival. So creative, you can kind of just go around and do building. We'll talk about that in a second. But then they added survival, which is kind of what you expected to have been in the game to begin with, but it wasn't there. It's a natural fit for the game. You know, reduced resources that you're gathering. It's much easier to die. Survival mode works for this kind of game. And it's it kind of sucks that they didn't have it in at launch, but the fact that they put it in at 1.1 is a big deal. On top of that, they added base building and farming, so you can kind of build prefabbed buildings, piece them together, and do all this cool base building stuff. And then you could do farming for different resources, which was really nice. And that was nice for creative mode, because then you could kind of go and get creative with building your stuff in much of a way that you would see in Minecraft. And then they added freighters, which are those massive ships in space, which is really cool. It essentially was a massive inventory increase for those who had the credits to go, or units, or whatever they call it, to go and purchase these things. They were really big. You could hire people to come onto your ship and be part of your crew. And again, it was kind of just a massive inventory increase, because you would park your small ships into it, and you would fly the freighters around and do that kind of stuff. But if you were down on the planet, you could teleport resources back up to your freighter. So essentially it was just a massive inventory, but that's really nice too, because freighters are cool to have, and it was kind of a dream of people to have from the beginning, but you know, they weren't able to get it at launch. On top of that, you have massive sweeping UI changes that made the game more playable, and then you have the first phase of graphics changes in 1.1, such as anti-aliasing, which really sharpened the game up a bit, made it not look like garbage, because, again, the game that we got at launch looked really, really garbage compared to the game that we saw in trailers. The game we saw in trailers was bright, colorful, and beautiful. The game we got at launch was brown and drab and gross, and texture work was awful. Then 1.2 came. So after 1.1, people came back to the game. We're like, okay, base building's cool. We see where this is going. Maybe there's hope for this game yet. 1.2 comes out a bit later, adds a huge host of graphical changes, including ambient occlusion, which in layman's terms, ambient occlusion just makes the lighting look better because it takes into account the fact that in a situation where a shadow is being laid out behind an object because of lighting, it also takes into account all of the lighting that is bouncing off objects nearby, which then adjusts the fact that that shadow isn't going to be just a shadow. You know, the shadow changes based on how objects around it affect it. That's essentially what ambient occlusion is. It does a really good job of making lighting look really good. They also added high and ultra textures to the game, including high contrast lighting, which it really changed a lot of stuff, and God rays. So it was with 1.2 that the game started looking like that game that we saw in the trailers, and it was really gorgeous. And that's why they added photo mode in 1.2, where you could just kind of float around with everything paused and just take really cool pictures of this stuff that you were exploring in high resolution photos. And I think it really helped make that game look like it did in the trailers. And then they added the ability to share your bases with workshop support on Steam. They added starship specializations, you know, like there's freighters, there's fighters, there's explorers, you know, there's different kinds of starships, and they all have their own roles. Then there's class ratings on those starships, so like A, B, C class, you know, different kinds of ships that look essentially the same, may be completely different in the fact that one has a much higher class rating than the other. So one is worth a lot more money than the others. And most importantly in this update, to me, they added exocraft. So they added ships that you could use on the planet. They had added 3 of them. There's like this cool little floaty one that's really fast. They added like a little car, like a little buggy that is a bit of fast, but also has some inventory space. And they added this like big old mammoth of a tank that you could just go and mine a ton of stuff with because it had a massive inventory, but it wasn't very fast. But the fact that they added these ships made traversing the planets a lot better and a lot more fun. In fact, the midcraft, I think it's called the Nomad. I don't remember exactly what they call it, but it is basically driving the Nomad from Mass Effect Andromeda. It is awesome. It is really fun to drive around, and you can upgrade it and change the way that the ship behaves, or maybe you have a bit more mining capabilities or a bit more fighting capabilities. It doesn't really matter. You can change it, and it has its own inventory space, and it's really fun to drive around on the planet. Plus, you can put these little pads down on any planet you want. You don't have to have a base there. You just put a pad down. You can summon that craft. It's the same one that you had on your other planets with the same inventory and whatnot. So you put the craft down, you start exploring a new planet, you find a ton of stuff, you ship all that back to your ship, and then you could essentially go back up into space, go to a different planet, put down a new pad, and you would still have that exocraft that you had from the previous planet, which is great. And I think the exocrafts massively change how you play this game in a really good way, because it makes that planetary exploration a lot better than it was previously. On top of that, they added faction reputation. So, you know, different factions would have different reputation. You gain that reputation by doing stuff with them. They added new vendors. They added hardcore mode, or they added permadeath mode, but it is a hardcore mode, which is essentially survival, but with permadeath. And I think that, again, was something that probably needed to be in the game from the beginning. And it's a little frustrating playing survival mode and then just instantly dying, just like it is in any hardcore mode. But it needed to be there. And it also added a new mode for these people who were sticking with the game to go and explore and have fun with. But it was these 2 patches that laid the foundation for Atlas Rises, which is 1.3, to be as good as it is and to drastically change the game in a very, very good way. So essentially, they launched in a terrible spot. We look at it, we're like, this is not the game that we want. They come out with 2 updates. We're like, okay, I see what you're doing with this. You're kind of adding these systems to the game that are going to drastically change things when you add stuff later. And in fact, that's exactly what we get with 1.3. They utilize all those systems. They add all this cool stuff into the game that uses those. They go and they change a lot of stuff. They rebalance some stuff. And it gives us a game that is that trailer that we originally saw. Atlas Rises adds a ton of stuff. It adds 30 hours of a story content to it, which is really nice. I've been doing it. Again, I'm kind of avoiding it in the background, but it is really cool, and there's a lot of intriguing things there. It's a lot of fun to do, and it weirdly works as a really cool tutorial, because as you go through this story content, it now is kind of unlocking things for you. You don't really start with a lot of stuff to begin with, and as you go through the story content, it's unlocking these recipes for you. It's teaching you base building. It's teaching you how to make the exocraft, and these are like requirements as mission objectives in this story content. And again, it works as a really nice way of introducing the game to somebody, something that probably could have been there at launch, but it just wasn't. So if you are someone who is interested in No Man's Sky now, you're like, this looks really cool, this sounds really cool now that it's actually a good game, then this is perfect for you because it teaches you how to play the game without you having to just wander around and feel aimless in a way. On top of that, they added procedurally generated faction missions. So this faction reputation we had before, now you can gain missions from them, which will give you different rewards and different kinds of like ways to make things or ways to upgrade your weapons. And the fact that it is procedural means that sometimes you'll get like really good ones to begin with, sometimes you won't. It doesn't really matter. You're exploring a galaxy, you'll eventually get everything if you wanted it. They added interstellar economy and star system economics, so you could do trading between different star systems with all these like different trade goods, because different star systems want different kinds of trade goods, so you kind of create like a trade route, which is really cool. I've been doing that. It's a pretty easy way to make money. They overhauled combat for space combat and overhauled the AI, so it's not so annoying to deal with in space. They added terrain manipulation, so when you're on planets, you can kind of manipulate terrain with this cool gun that you have, and you can make like underground complexes for your bases if you wanted to. They redid biome generation, a complete overhaul, so now planets are looking way better than they ever have, and planet diversity is much more apparent. They redid the UI, tons of UI improvements. They added S-class ships. They added the ability to summon your ship when you're on the planet. They added low altitude flight while you're flying around, which was really frustrating before to fly around on a planet because it just didn't feel good. Now you can fly around kind of really low to the ground. They added crashed freighters. So when you're exploring planets, sometimes you'll find a freighter that has crashed and has a ton of resources and stuff for you there. And then most importantly, because I'm a Stargate fan, they added stargates to the game, like legitimate stargates. It's a portal, and if you have the dialing code for different planets, you could just go to those planets and explore them. So people are posting, like different codes to the planets that they found, or like the Galactic Center and stuff like that, and you could just go to those planets, or you can discover them on your own, which is another really cool way of doing it. But they've added stargates to the game, and it's really, really cool. It's a nice way of traversing the universe very quickly, especially when you consider the fact that there is now the first wave of multiplayer. Yes, that's right. If you didn't ever play the game at launch, you probably would be surprised to hear that there was no multiplayer. Maybe you're not surprised because you heard that in all the terrible reviews, because the game made it seem like, there's like, that's so big. And one of the major things to come out of Hello Games during the time of launch, or right before it, was that the game is so massive, it's such a big universe, you'll probably never see another player anyway. So it made it seem like you could see another player. So people tried, but there was no way. There was actual no multiplayer going on with it. Now there is. Now you can see, I think, up to currently 16 different players. They don't exist as a player at the moment. They exist as like a little light. And the little light floats around, and you can see them interacting with things, and you can follow them around. You can explore together. But there's actually multiplayer. So if you and your friends want to play together, you can, which is really, really cool. But the multiplayer is limited at the moment. And the way that they make it seem in the game at the moment is that as you go along and as we get more updates, this multiplayer will be expanded, and maybe you won't just see a little light anymore. Maybe you'll actually see a person, which is really, really cool, and I'm looking forward to that. And the fact that they've started to add this multiplayer stuff really changes my own perception of the game, because this was a pretty lonely game before, just exploring a massive galaxy, even though there were a ton of like aliens and whatnot. There was nobody to explore it with. And I think that's a big draw for me, is I want to explore this universe with my friends. And now I can kind of start doing that. And I think that's really cool, because that was one of the things that made Minecraft really good. It was not playing by yourself, making your own little fort, though many people did that. It was once you got into a multiplayer game, you started playing with your friends, that game became exponentially better. And I think with the first steps of multiplayer in Atlas Rises, we're going to start seeing that this game becomes exponentially better when you start playing with your friends and making bases together. But that's essentially a roundup of everything that was added into the game in this last year. There's more to come. I'm excited for what's more to come. But it makes me really curious about this whole situation that Hello Games has gotten themselves in. Because, like I said at the beginning, you don't see this very often, where a game 1 year from launch goes right back up to the top sales on Steam and goes from mostly negative reviews to mostly positive. That's a really big deal, and that's something that us as gamers should take note of. Because this game is something that I think a lot of people were interested in, and especially were wanting to play when it first came out, because they had that grand idea of what we saw in the trailers. Now that that game is actually pretty much what that grand idea was, and looks like it, because the game is really beautiful now, it makes me really excited for what's to come, because finally their vision for this game is starting to come to fruition, and their vision for this game was incredible. Like, I don't think there was a single person out there that didn't really want what they first showed. Like, it looked fun, it looked really cool, it looked grand and spectacular, but we didn't really know what the gameplay was, because I don't think they knew what the gameplay was at that point. And now that we know what the gameplay is, and we're getting that really cool, grand exploration game with a lot of base building and resource gathering and now multiplayer, it has, I think it's a very good argument for giving games another chance. Not something that we see very often in the games industry. But over the last year or two, we're starting to see more examples of this, of games that launch and maybe don't really get a lot of traction to begin with, or maybe launch in a bad state. And over the course of a year, or 2 years, or 3 years, they slowly get more updates and they earn the trust back of the people who wanted to play the game initially. And that audience begins to grow and more people come back to the game. In a similar but not exact situation, you have like Rainbow Six Siege. It's a game that didn't get a lot of or didn't get a massive player base at launch, but over the course of a couple of years now, it has gained a massive player base and an avid player base, because that game has improved a lot. Not that it was bad at launch, but it has improved a lot, and they've added different kinds of game modes and different like esports kind of things to it. And it's interesting to watch that game grow, because it's not a game that you expected to grow when it first came out. You expected that audience to drop off and not a lot of people to come back to it. I think as of right now, we're seeing that with Lawbreakers. We're going to see a game that launches with a pretty small player base, but that player base is going to grow exponentially over time. And in the case of No Man's Sky, we saw a game that had a huge player base at launch that was instantly crushed because they didn't get the game that they thought they were getting. And now Hello Games is doing their best job that they possibly can do to extend an olive branch to that community and bring them back to this game. And I'm one of those people, you know. Again, the game was okay at launch, but it wasn't something that I was super excited for once I played it. It was like, okay, I see what this is. Maybe not for me. This is now for me. This game is incredible. I've had more fun in the 30 hours I've put in this game this week than I have in many of the other games that I've played recently, with the exception of Life is Strange, because that game like fundamentally changed my life recently. But this, you know, this game as it is now with 1.3 is an incredible game. And it was on sale for like $20 on Steam with this launch of this patch. And like, that is totally worth it. When the game first launched, it was probably a $20 game to me, even though they were selling it for full price. I would have happily paid $20 for the launch game and not really felt any remorse. Obviously, you know, people are going to change how they feel on that based on their own economics in their life. But with me, I would have paid $20 for it and felt, you know, pretty okay with paying $20 for the launch price. Now, I feel like this game is worth the $60, and yet it's on sale for $20. Like, go pick this up. It is really good, especially if you're kind of on the fence about it, because there's so much more to this game now than there was at launch, and the fact that they've added this 1.3 update gives me so much more hope for what they're going to do in the future, and this is definitely a game I will continue to come back to, because there's so much in this game that you, like the basic gameplay loop can kind of get a little tiny bit repetitive, but with the added exo craft and being able to drive around on planets and different ships that they're adding and freighters and stuff like that, and now multiplayer, there's a lot more here than you initially would think. And also with the fact that they've added, hardcore modes, which will be really fun to do in multiplayer, I think. Or on top of that, if you have all of these stargates being able to take you to new and interesting planets that you wouldn't normally be able to explore because they're on the other side of the galaxy. I think this is all really intriguing and really, really cool. And it is the best case that we have in recent memory for giving a game another chance. Not just giving a game another chance, giving a studio another chance. No game developer out there worth their penny will ever release a game that they are releasing maliciously. Hello Games never wanted to release this game in the way that they did. I can guarantee you that. As someone who has recently dabbled in a lot of game design, I would tell you that there is no person out there that would release the game that they released at launch and feel proud about it, but also want to have released that. I think that they were definitely pressured into it, and they knew that they really could only gain that game that they wanted at the beginning with all their trailers, and they could make that vision that they had for this game through the process of patching it and trying to gain that trust back from the player base. So there was no point in this process that they released this game and said, ha, we tricked you. They never wanted to do that, but that's what happened. And that's unfortunate, which is why they went radio silent, because they knew that no matter what they said, it wasn't going to help. And if you've ever had any kind of relationship with somebody, which you have because you're a human being, you know that sometimes people hurt you. Your friends hurt you, your significant others hurt you. Sometimes it happens. And oftentimes the best thing to do is to just not say anything for a bit and just let it linger and just be kind of okay with distance for maybe a couple hours. Then you go back, you talk to that person when you've calmed down a bit. And I think that that's exactly what they were trying to do here. They were ashamed of the product they launched. They went radio silent. And I think they did exactly what they should have done, though it may have been better, again, as I said at the beginning, to have a little bit more communication than they did. But they heartbroke themselves. They heartbroke their fan base that was there at launch. And they have come back with a massive gift to the player base and a huge olive branch and are like, hey, we're sorry. We want to make the game that we wanted to make. Here it is. And they've now presented us with this awesome game. This game went from like a 5 out of 10 for me to an 8 out of 10 with this patch. And I just can't wait to see what is coming up again with all of these other things. And in fact, in an interesting way, again, I've put 30 hours into this game and I've significantly tried to avoid story stuff for you guys in the background. So I'm just kind of like driving around and having fun and doing what I would normally do. But at the same time, like, I'm sitting here while I'm playing it going, man, maybe I should restart from the beginning as survival and try to explore new stuff and see what else I can find, because I have found some incredible planets in my journey that are just gorgeous. And I've found some pretty big hellholes too. But it's that process of discovering those things that makes me want to start over from a different point in the galaxy and see if I can get a couple friends in and find a Stargate and give them my coordinates so that they can portal over to me and we can explore together. And maybe I can find cool new ships that I've never seen before and buy a new freighter, that kind of thing. Maybe make a new base now that I have a little bit understanding of how to make a base, because I haven't done it before in this game. And it's that process of like, you learned and now you want to restart that is really interesting to me. And it's something that I did a lot in games like Terraria and Stardew Valley and Minecraft. The fact that when you start over, you have all this newfound knowledge that you didn't have before, but you don't necessarily have that same discovery of finding that knowledge. You just have the discovery of using that knowledge from the beginning. That is really interesting. And it's something that in my very busy life at the moment, I wouldn't think that I would have time to play No Man's Sky, especially as much as I have this week, and be enjoying it. And yet I am. And I think that this is a game you need to give another shot, especially if you haven't given a shot already. This game is worth it now. This game is awesome. This game is a lot of fun. I can see where their vision is going, and I want to be on that journey with them to the end. They've gained my trust back, and I think that you should certainly try to give them yours again, because what they're doing is awesome. Yeah, I think that's the best way to put it. And if you've been watching the gameplay in the background, you're like, that looks weird. What is he doing? That's not necessarily the normal gameplay loop. Again, I'm trying to avoid the story stuff, but once you finish the story stuff, like, there's a couple things to do in the game. There's the story stuff now, which is awesome. There's a lot of stuff to do there. There's also a couple other goals. There's like getting to the center of the galaxy and seeing where the heck you're going, and then getting to that core, and that journey is really interesting and cool and exciting, and it's very replayable because anytime you start over, you will start in a different part and you will find things that nobody else has found. You'll be able to discover them and upload them to the internet and be like, this is the thing that I found, or you can name it whatever you want, which is pretty cool. But on the other side of things, there's also the Atlas Pass, which is another very intriguing story thing, like what the heck's going on with that. So now you have 3 avenues to explore in this game outside of just going around and building a base, which is another new avenue, and exploring all these different planets. So yeah, it's really cool. There's a lot to be had here, especially if you can get the game on sale. It's absolutely worth it, especially even if you can find players to play with. Because when multiplayer gets expanded, this game is just going to get cooler and cooler and cooler. And there's really not much more I can say about the game other than it is fun. And that's not something I said at the game when it launched. And like I said, I think this is the best case for giving somebody your trust back. And I want to know, if you've been playing No Man's Sky, what do you think of it now? So leave that in the comments below. Let me know all of your thoughts. Or are you enjoying what you're seeing in the background? If you haven't picked it up, or if you haven't touched it since 1.3, or since launch rather, does what I'm saying and what I'm showing you in the background look interesting? If so, let me know that kind of thing. I want to know your thoughts on all this, because this is an intriguing little story in the area of game development that we're going to hear about for a long time, and I think is going to be something that we look back on in 10 years and kind of reminisce, like, oh yes, do you remember when Hello Games launched that terrible game that they made good? Maybe this future company can also do that with this game that probably launched their terrible game in 10 years. We'll see how that ends up panning out, you know, whether or not people use this as a crux and like, oh, this one thing happened back in the day. Maybe the studio can also turn it around that, you know, is struggling at the moment. We don't know. But with that being said, I'm going to go play more No Man's Sky. That was hard to say. But I'm actually looking forward to doing it. And I think that speaks for itself. So with that, we shall see you guys next time.